It's March 1891. In the city of Liverpool, fans gather around the now famous Anfield Stadium to welcome home their team who, despite losing their final game of the season, have just been crowned Football League champions for the first time. Everton are welcomed home to Anfield to a hero... Hang on a minute. Everton? Home at Anfield? No, that can't be right. Fancy that. Despite being deep-rooted as the historic home of Liverpool Football Club, Anfield was originally home to their local rivals Everton, a side that built the original foundations of the famous stadium that we know today. But how did this happen? Why did Everton leave? Where did Liverpool come from? And why is a pub landlord so important to the story? Well, before we go into that, we need to go way back for some context as per usual. Everton's origins date back to the 1870s, to the St Domingo Methodist Church in Liverpool. The church put on a number of social activities to keep young people from caving their own heads in due to boredom. A cricket team was originally put together by Reverend Benjamin Swift Chambers, but being notoriously difficult to play during the winter months, he needed something else to keep the young'uns amused. So, in 1878, B.S. Chambers formed a football team, St Domingo FC. St Domino's originally played their games on an open field in Stanley Park, and quickly found itself with a relatively large fan base. Given that there wasn't much else to do in the 1870s, people from outside of the church were eager to join the newly formed side. So, in 1879, the club decided to open up its doors to people from outside of the parish, as well as rename the club to Everton FC to better reflect the wider area. Playing at Stanley Park brought about a number of problems. Being a public park meant that the large crowds that would attend games would often encroach on the pitch. There was also the issue of lost ticket sales, on account of their home ground being open to the public. To further compound things, the FA was planning on introducing some fresh new laws in 1883, which would grant referees the power to abandon a match in the event any spectators intruded upon the field, which I thought would have been an obvious rule from the outset, but what do I know? Eager to earn some cash from the growing interest around the team, as well as ensure they weren't booted out from many competitions, the club began its search for a more appropriate home, one where they could charge for entry, as well as shore up their defences from those pesky pitch invaders. Speaking of shoring up defences, today's video partner is NordVPN. While NordVPN won't be able to protect you from hundreds of angry Evertonians, it will be able to keep you safe from online attacks. No, not those kind of attacks. I'm talking about a front free of malware, phishing, and the person who's collecting your data every time you connect to free pub Wi-Fi. NordVPN will keep your online activity encrypted at all times, while NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro safeguards you by checking your downloads for threats and blocking any sketchy looking links that you happen to click on. I'm using NordVPN right now, and it's like having a world-class back four protecting me online. Metaphorically speaking, of course. I imagine in reality footballers aren't very good at the whole cybersecurity thing. That's a terrible metaphor now I think about it. Use the unique creator link NordVPN/RootNone to receive an extra 4 months service when you purchase a 2-year plan. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and you won't find a better deal for NordVPN anywhere else. So head on over to nordvpn.com/RootNone and start protecting your online activity. Enter John Houlding, a local businessman in the brewery industry. The man who would become Everton's inaugural president was asked to help with the running of the club, and was now leading the search for a new base for the side. Big John and Everton initially found a new home after they were offered a plot of land off the Priory Road by owner William Croyt. However, despite investing in hoardings, turnstiles and changing rooms for the club, Mr. Croyt kicked Everton out of their new home after just a season, due to their fans making too much of a bloody racket. Faced with being homeless for the coming season, President Houlding found a solution through one of his friends in the brewery business, Joseph Orrell, and his uncle, John. The two Johns and Joe reached an agreement for Everton to lease a patch of land that the Orrells owned opposite their former pitch in Stanley Park. Their new home, which would be known as Anfield, was established in 1884 ahead of the new season. The agreement, initially, was that the land was leased from the Orrells to John Houlding, who then in turn subleased it to Everton for the sum of £100 per year. However, this arrangement would change the following year in 1885, when John Houlding purchased the land from the Orrells for a whopping £6,000, which put Everton in the position where they were paying rent to their own president, which I'm sure will no way at all create any conflict of interests later on in this video. Everton's stay at Anfield was a time of incredible growth for the club. The ground was converted from essentially nothing to a 20,000-seater state-of-the-art stadium, which not only drew huge crowds for Everton, but also hosted an England international match as well. In 1885, the club turned professional, and 3 years later the club became one of the 12 founding members of the English Football League. This would culminate in Everton being crowned Football League champions for the 1890-1891 season, bringing the title home to Anfield for the very first time. With Everton established as one of the biggest clubs in the country, as well as an international standard stadium to call home, the future looked bright for Everton Football Club. Surely nothing could possibly go wrong. Right? Right? Everton's world would be flipped upside down at the beginning of the 1891-1892 season, when President John Houlding informed the Everton Committee that John Orrell, who still owned the land that Anfield was adjacent to, was planning on building a new road. The problem for Everton being that the proposed road would go straight through one of their newly built stands. And not only this, he had the legal right to do so. So how did this come to pass? Well, when John Houlding purchased the land from the Orrells in 1885, there was a clause included into the contract which gave John Orrell the right to build an access road along the boundary. The contract negotiations were between the Orrells and Johnny Houlding, not Everton FC, which raises a number of questions. Did Houlding tell Everton about the clause? Was he aware about the clause himself when he signed the contract? If he did know about the clause, why did he let Everton build a stand there? Why did the Orrells let them build a stand there? A football stand's hardly inconspicuous, is it? And why can't I remember Saturday night? Truth be told, the Everton committee were more than a little miffed with their president after this revelation. Tensions were already high between president and club after Mr. Houlding raised rent from £100 to £250 per year in 1890. And this latest incident just added to the mistrust that was starting to grow between the two parties. The club were now faced with either tearing down the new stand they had just built, or finding a way to appease John Orrell. The initial solution the committee came up with was to offer rent to Mr. Orrell for his land. Orrell agreed to rent out his plot for the club to use as a training ground in exchange for a hefty £120 per year, on top of the £250 that they were already paying to their president for Anfield. This was already far more than any other team in the Football League was paying on rent, and despite requesting that Mr. Houlding reduce his share, the duo stood firm on their combined figure of £370. John Houlding proposed an alternative solution. He suggested that the club should form a limited company, much like Woolwich Arsenal in a previous video I created, to raise funds through the selling of shares. With that money, he proposed that Everton could then not only purchase Orrell's land, but the land that Anfield was on, from himself. To some within the club, buying all of that land seemed like an unnecessary expense, but Houlding would explain he had grand plans to increase the size of Anfield using the extra space by laying an athletics track, so that Anfield could be used for football autumn through to spring and athletics in the summer months. This set off alarm bells for some within the club. Truth be told, Houlding didn't have many friends on the Everton committee, despite his investment over the years. This new corporate structure would strengthen his position at the club at a time that many may have wanted him out. Houlding's connection to the brewery business was already an uncomfortable subject for many within the club, who were still connected with the anti-alcohol Methodist church. Liverpool, during the 1800s, had a terrible reputation for drunkenness, and many members of the club disliked the fact that the team had been using the Sandon pub as a dressing room on match days, and while no alcohol was served at Anfield itself, some were worried that Houlding's potential power grab could lead to alcohol being sold within the ground. This was clearly a huge financial and moral dilemma for the club. There was an ambitious plan on the table to grow Anfield and Everton with a forward-thinking corporate structure, but it meant getting into bed with a conservative entrepreneur who didn't represent the values of the club. Everton initially agreed to Houlding's proposal, before another alternative was found. This is George Mahon, a local accountant and active member of not only the Methodist Church, but the Everton FC committee. Mr. Mahon and his associates were opposed to John Houlding's plans. Being a member of the Liberal Party, he was against the idea of the club being in the hands of a few powerful individuals, as well as believing that it was totally unacceptable for the club to be paying £370 per year on rent. He and his subcommittee had identified a site along the Goodison Road, which had been offered to them for a bargain price of £50 per year in rent. And while the grounds would need some investment to bring them up to speed, it was a cheaper option than the solution put forward by the club's president, John Houlding. At a meeting on the 25th of January 1892, the Everton committee voted overwhelmingly to reject their president's proposal and instead move ahead with the relocation to the site that would become known as Goodison Park. They gave their president 7 days to respond with a more competitive offer on their lease agreement before moving forward. John Houlding would have no doubt been and not from the booze he was brewing. He was losing his position of power, and now the Everton committee held all the cards. The day after the meeting, in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, Mr. Houlding took the train down to London and, unbeknownst to those at the club, registered a new company with Somerset House, Everton Football Club and Athletics Ground Limited. Johnny was attempting to pull a sly one and steal Everton FC. Everton Football Club were fuming, because now there was technically two Everton football clubs. The original Everton that had won the Football League the previous season, and imposter Everton that intended to carry on playing football at Anfield. Luckily for OG Everton, the FA quickly intervened, ruling that a new club could not share the same name as an existing member. The original Everton were recognised as the one true Everton to rule them all, and John Houlding's attempted hostile takeover was stuck in the bin. The president was finished. A decision was made by Everton to part ways with John Houlding and Anfield, as they looked to Goodison Park for the future. Everton played their final game at Anfield, as the home side at least, on the 18th of April 1892, a 5-2 loss to Bolton Wanderers. Much like Gus Mears and Stamford Bridge a decade later, John Houlding was now the owner of a world-class stadium but no team. As well as this, he now had the same problem that Everton had before, of having to fork out some kind of compensation to John Orrell in order to safeguard the future of Anfield. In June 1892, Houlding and the few former Everton members that had remained loyal to him renamed the new club to Liverpool Football Club and Athletics Ground Company and assembled a new squad to compete in the Lancashire League the following season. 2 years later, Liverpool FC completed the purchase of land from both John Houlding and John Orrell. An athletics track was never laid at the stadium. Everton would go on to form a limited company like Houlding initially suggested, albeit with a more liberal allocation of shares to fans. Just 6% of shares in Everton FC were owned collectively by its 10 directors, compared to 54% of club shares owned by the directors of Liverpool Football Club. The club eventually purchased the land at Goodison Park in 1895 and would go on to build it into a state-of-the-art stadium, much like Anfield before. They would have to wait 20 years for another league title, finally bringing the First Division Championship home to Goodison Park in 1915. During the time in between, the league title would make its way back to Anfield on 2 occasions, in 1901 and 1906, but this time with Liverpool as the winners. So, what are the legacy of John Houlding? Well, it's complicated. While we can hopefully agree that attempting to hijack Everton Football Club was not cool, it would be a disservice to John Houlding to have him solely as the antagonist in this story. After all, he did help fund the club in its formative years, at great risk to his own finances, and it was his connections that allowed Everton to make the move to Anfield, which in turn helped propel them to one of the biggest clubs in the country. There's no doubt that he was a very influential figure in the rise of the club. There's no doubt that he wanted to profit from his investments of time and money. Truth is, this was much bigger than a simple dispute over rent. It was a clash of cultures. On one hand, you had the more liberal, anti-alcoholic Methodists. On the other hand, you had the conservative, pro-alcohol capitalists. Even if the two sides had come to some kind of agreement in 1892, it surely wasn't a partnership that was destined to last. It's probably for the best that the divorce happened sooner rather than later, because it gave time for both of the new teams to flourish. Otherwise, we might be living in an alternative timeline where the Merseyside derby is Tranmere Rovers versus Marine, or Southport versus Bootle FC, or Lower Breck FC versus Prescott Cables. Actually, it sounds quite fun, that. Thank you very much for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you've made it this far, it's usually a good sign that you did enjoy it. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. It will help support the channel and help it grow. And don't forget to check out some of the other silly videos that are on the channel, and hopefully you'll enjoy those too.